It's July 3rd, 1971 in Paris. The poet, rock god, and lead singer of The Doors, Jim Morrison, is found dead in a bathtub. He was only 27 years old. At least that's what we're told. What followed was a storm of confusion, secrecy, and decades of conspiracy theories, resulting in one of the most controversial deaths in rock and roll history. In the spring of 1971, just after recording Alley Woman with The Doors, Jim moved to Paris for a fresh start. He was burnt out from the rock and roll lifestyle and the pressures that fame brought. Paris seemed like a good place to escape the fast-moving LA lifestyle, shake off his alcohol addiction, and focus more on his poetry. After all, Jim had always seen himself as more of a poet than a rock star. And what better place to write poetry than Paris? He joined his girlfriend, Pamela Courson, in her apartment, who had already been living there. Although a few months later, in the same apartment, there was one night Jim did not return to bed. Courson claims that the couple returned to their apartment around 1 a.m. after attending a late-night movie screening. She woke at 6 a.m., noticed he hadn't come to bed, so she went to check on him. She found him in the bathtub. At first, she thought he was playing a joke, as he often did, but this time, he wasn't moving. Morrison was pronounced dead. The official cause? Heart failure. No autopsy, no toxicology report. It wasn't required by French law, because nothing was suspected. That was his death, on paper. But is it the truth? The strange circumstances surrounding Jim's death left a lot of unanswered questions. There were only two people we know of that ever saw his body: Pamela and Jim's friend, Alain Ronay. The signature on his death certificate is eligible, even though Pamela forgot the name of the doctor who signed. To this day, no one knows who it was. As far as his funeral goes, his casket was closed. Both of his parents, his brother, and sister were alive at the time of Jim's death, but Pamela told the American embassy Jim had no living family. This allowed for a quick, no questions asked burial at Père Lachaise Cemetery. Alain Ronay, a longtime friend and photographer of Jim's, was one of the last people to see him alive, and one of the few to witness what happened in the hours after his death. Many years later, Ronay revealed his account of Jim's passing in an article he wrote titled "Jim and I, Friends Until Death." On July 2nd, just one day before Jim's death, the two spent time together walking around Paris. Ronay recalled that Jim seemed unwell, anxious, and struggling with a strange case of very powerful hiccups that plagued him all day. Their conversations veered towards existential themes. Oddly enough, death was one of the main topics. Jim was reluctant to let Ronay leave him. Although begging him to stay, Ronay eventually left the cafe they were at. This would be the last time he ever saw Jim. The next morning, Pamela called him in panic. Jim was already gone. Ronay rushed to the apartment. Then Pamela told him her story. She stated that the previous night, her and Jim returned to their apartment after the movie screening and began snorting drugs together. This was out of character for Jim, considering his drug of choice was alcohol. Then Jim began to play all of his songs, one after another, eventually asking Pam for more drugs. Then they both went to sleep. Later, Pamela woke up to Jim experiencing breathing problems. She dragged him to the tub, fixed him a bath, then went to bed. When she woke up again, she noticed Jim hadn't returned to bed yet. Ronay, Pamela, and others worked quickly to cover up what had really happened. There was fear that if the overdose came to light, there would be a scandal, and possibly legal consequences for everyone involved. Ronay convinced authorities that Jim would never do drugs, he only drank, resulting in no autopsy or toxicology report. To delay any further attention, he gave them Jim's name backwards, Douglas James Morrison, rather than James Douglas Morrison. Ronay believed Jim overdosed, likely in his apartment, but none of that ever made the official report. It was a story they agreed to bury. But according to nightclub manager Sam Bernett, Jim didn't die in his apartment at all. In 2007, Bernett finally told his side of the story. He claims the real story starts at the Roll Circus nightclub around 2 a.m. Bernett says Morrison came to the club that night, looking to buy drugs for his girlfriend. Not long after, a cloakroom attendant reported someone locked in a bathroom stall. When Bernett and a bouncer broke in, they found Morrison collapsed over the toilet. We were certain he'd been snorting heroin because there was foam coming out of his lips, as well as blood, Bernett recalled. A customer that worked as a medic pronounced him dead on scene. Then 2 unknown men, believed to be drug dealers, carried his body out of the club, into a car, then disappeared. Bernett says that shortly later, he received a call from a club representative, warning him to keep quiet about what happened. It's believed he was then brought back to his apartment, where he was found dead in the bathtub. Bernett claims that singer Marianne Faithfull was also in the club that night and warned to stay quiet. Although when Marianne came out with her side of the story, she didn't mention the Roll Circus nightclub at all, which adds more questions to Jim's death, especially considering he had joked several times about faking his own death. Marianne's story revolves around her boyfriend at the time, Count Jean de Breteuil, a known drug dealer to rock royalty. It is said he dealt drugs to Keith Richards of the Stones and supplied Janis Joplin with the drugs that killed her. Years later, in an interview with Mojo magazine, Marianne Faithfull stated, "I was living with Jean at Le Hotel in Paris, and it seemed that he was the guy who killed Jim Morrison. That's what he said anyway. I've killed Jim Morrison. He provided the gear." Marianne recalls feeling a sense of trouble when her then boyfriend left to pay a visit to Jim's apartment. "I could intuitively feel trouble, I thought. I'll take a few to a now, and I won't be there. And he went to see Jim Morrison and killed him. I mean, I'm sure it was an accident. Poor bastard. The smack was too strong? Yeah, and he died." When Jean returned home, he fled to his mother's house in Marrakesh and took Marianne with him. He died from an overdose, less than a year later, at age 22. To this day, theories surrounding Jim's death still circulate. Some people believe he never died at all. After all, his social security profile is still somehow active and traces to the New York area. He often joked about faking his death, escaping the madness of fame to live freely under a new name. A recent documentary, Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison, explores the theory that Morrison became a man known as Frank, a janitor in Syracuse, New York. Frank has similar speech patterns, a scar where Jim had a mole. His eyes are brown, although appear to be ringed with blue, suggesting he wears color-changing contacts. Even an old photo shows him with Doors drummer John Densmore. When approached, of course Frank denies this theory. But who wouldn't? It's been over 50 years since his disappearance. Regardless of how Jim died, or whether or not he's still alive, he will be missed by friends and fans around the world. Although he may be gone, his legacy lives on through his music and poetry. What do you believe really happened to Jim Morrison? Let us know in the comments.